So those were the very basic camera skills that you guys need to know. The rest that I'm going to go into, I absolutely have other courses on. If you are interested in learning more about a camera and actually getting into photography, those classes I definitely recommend. Right now, I'm going to try and sum up those in-depth classes in just a few minutes. But these technical camera skills you absolutely don't need to have to do this stock photography. So if you're not interested in that, jump to the next video. If you are interested, then hang on. We'll get into it. But yeah, like I said, you absolutely don't need to know these in-depth camera stuff to still have good passive income through stock photography. So real quick, okay, so cameras, the way that cameras work, this is a very basic crash course into cameras, real quick. Cameras basically capture light that exists in the world. The light goes through the camera, hits the camera's sensor, and registers that, processes that as the picture. So basically you think of the lens is at the end of the camera, the light goes through the lens. The lens has a hole that it adjusts to let light in. It can be large or it can be small. The light goes through that hole and then passes through the shutter that opens and closes. You think of the sound of camera makes, that's the shutter opening and closing. So the light goes through the aperture, through the shutter, and then hits the sensor. And then the sensor has a level of sensitivity that captures how bright and how dark the image is as well. So it's really those three things. It's the lens aperture, the shutter speed, and then the sensor, the sensitivity of the camera. Those are really the three things that you're adjusting to create the perfect harmony of light to create a picture. So real quick, let's go over all those. So the aperture is the hole that gets larger and smaller. The larger the hole is, the more light comes in. The smaller the hole is, the less light that comes in. That's pretty straightforward. With all three of these things, the aperture, the shutter speed, and the camera sensitivity, all of them adjust the light, but they all have like a different side effect to the image itself. So with the aperture side effect is the larger that hole, the less that's in focus. So right now I'm filming on a fairly large aperture. So right now I'm in focus, but if I were to lean back here, I'm out of focus. And that's because I'm working with a large aperture. If I had a smaller aperture, more would be in focus and you would be able to get me in focus here as well as back on the couch or something like that. So one thing that's important to note also about the aperture, the number that's associated with the aperture, and this is where it gets a little complicated, the number that's associated with the aperture is actually a denominator number. And so it has an inverse relationship with the size of the aperture. So the larger the hole, the more light coming in, the larger the hole, the smaller that number is. So a very large aperture is like a 1.8 or a 2 or something like that. The smaller the hole, less light comes in. Smaller the hole, the larger the number is. So a very small aperture would be something like a 16 or a 22 or something like that. So that's aperture for you. Moving on, we have shutter speed. So it's how fast the shutter moves. Intuitively, the slower the shutter speed, the slower the shutter speed, the more light comes through, the more time light has to come through. The faster the shutter speed, the less light comes through. Now, the side effect here is that the slower the shutter speed, it's not really focus, but it's kind of like motion blur or kind of like a smearing of the image. So slow shutter speed is used to do night photography or something that you need a lot of time in. You think of people with like sparklers and those pictures where they can write letters and words and stuff like that with little sparklers. That's because the shutter speed is so slow that light kind of smears across the image and makes words and things like that. So that's really for a stylistic choice. Typically you want a shutter of 100 or higher. So that's a faster speed that keeps everything sharp and in focus and doesn't have any of that smearing. So again, getting a little in depth, a good rule of thumb for shutter speed is shutter speed should be twice the lens length. So if you're shooting on a full frame camera, you don't need to know any of this photography skills. This is just if you're interested. Shooting on a 50mm lens, you would want a shutter speed of 100. Shooting on a 100mm lens, a longer lens, you would want a shutter speed of 200, and so on. It's also important to note that with video, shutter should pretty much always be stuck at 50 or 60. That's just how our eyes are accustomed to seeing video. So 50 or 60 to video is what you want to stick with. So we have the aperture, we have the shutter. Once the light hits the sensor, we need to set our sensitivity. So that's referred to as the ISO. So the ISO, the higher the ISO, the more sensitive our sensor is, the more light comes in. The lower the ISO, the less sensitive, less light comes in. Now the byproduct of the ISO is how noisy and grainy our image looks. So it's pretty much objectively true that people want the lowest ISO possible in an image. And that's because they don't want the noise kind of interjected into the picture. Some people do enjoy, if you're going for a stylistic look, which is not for stock photography really, but if you're going for a stylistic look, you could have a high ISO or ASA if you're using a film camera. So you have a little bit of film noise. You know, smart, pretentious people say that they like the film noise, but not the video noise. So you definitely can add some noise if you want. Stock photography, you shouldn't be doing that. So you basically always want the lowest ISO possible that still gives you proper exposure within the image. And then also, when it comes to video, slow motion is a good option. So that's something to think about. With slow motion, you want to put that shutter, I'm going to jump back to shutter real quick. You want to put the shutter speed to twice the frame rate. So if the frame rate is typically about 24 or 25, maybe 30, the shutter is at that 50 or 60 that I was talking about. If you're doing slow motion, if you're shooting 60 frames a second, then you want your shutter at 120. So for slow motion, the shutter in video is always twice the frame rate. So that is crash course camera real quick. That was a lot of information. So if you guys are interested in really getting in depth with the camera, take one of the other courses because there's a lot more there at a better pace too.